Okay, we're going to work on the painting portion of the skull now. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to avoid using black and brown from the colored pencils. So we're just going to set those off to the side. And with our dark values that we're going to work with or try to use your blue or violet. Green will also work. In this case, I'm going to use blue. And looking at the image, I'm going to use blue wherever I see those darkest values in the image. Now, what I also want to do is, as I'm applying these values, you want to help form the skull by putting your pencil marks in the correct direction. And so as I lay down these areas of colored pencil, all of your marks that you're making, just look at the outside lines of the different parts of your drawings. So with these outside lines, these should curve. You're going to have very few, if any, just like straight up and down lines or just straight diagonal lines. So by adding these curved values, what this is going to do, this is going to help you in terms of forming the skull. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to put in the darkest values right now. So I'm working in the area where we have the eye socket. So there's a really dark portion right here. So I'm going to press a little bit harder to get that dark value. It's kind of even a line right here. That fades out just a little bit. So I'm still going to use my blue, but I'm just not going to press nearly as hard. And with the inner portion of the eye socket, you're getting these kind of curving upward type values. And then there's a little bit of just kind of a light value right near the end where we start to enter into the nasal region. So obviously inside the nasal cavity is pretty dark. So we're going to press pretty hard to get this nice and dark in the nose area. And then it starts to fade out right here. So again, I'm going to really look at those curved lines to help form this nasal cavity. So it does lighten up a little bit kind of on the edge right in this area. I'm going to press hard right there because it is a little bit darker. So I'm not just going to use blue. I am going to add some other colors, but for right now, we're just working with those dark values. So it's a little bit darker right in here. So this is where we have the cheekbone. And some of the lines you can see, some of the areas of bone in the image that have some lines to them. And that may even help you form this skull. So the other cheek is pretty dark. So put in this dark line and then add just a little less pressure for some of these other regions of the face. So this is the area where the temple is. So there's a dark spot right here. Kind of this abstract line we're working with. So that's going to be a little bit darker. So notice I'm still trying to curve a lot of those pencil marks that I'm putting down with my colored pencil. We also have this area of the forehead. So what you are seeing in the picture is there's kind of like this indentation. It's almost like the shape of like a bird, if you're just to draw a stereotypical bird type shape. And there's kind of like a little darker spot right here. So with the area where the forehead is, these lines are curved upward. And they're going to curve this way. And whenever I start painting, wherever I have the brightest spots, I am going to leave those just white, plain white of the paper. So I'm really just going to use two colors in this. I'm going to use blue, and then I'll pick another color out of my pencil selection. I'm going to put maybe some lighter kind of bluish marks right here. Maybe a little bit right on the bridge of the nose. So in some of these areas that have a little bit of darkness to them, but are a little bit brighter, so they're not nearly as dark as some of these other spots, I'm just spacing out some of my lines a little more clearly. So that way it'll help define some of the dark areas. There's kind of a dark spot right here. I forgot to draw that first time around. Just kind of put that in. There's also darker area right on the edge. And then on the chin, so we have some dark values on the chin, pretty pronounced shadow. This is going to fall right underneath the septum, or the middle part of the nose, and it will continue just a little bit on the left side. Now for the palate area, so this is the area above the teeth. In order to get this effect, I'm going to take my blue and the lines that I drew. I'm going to draw a fairly dark hard line on top of that line, and then I am going to just lightly kind of fade it out to white. So I'm going to repeat that step along all of these lines that I have. And so what this is doing, it's creating this kind of like ribbon effect. And the areas that we're working on, this is where the teeth would essentially fit into the socket of the skull. And there's this little bone underneath the septum. So there's kind of like a dark ridge right there. So I don't want to forget that. And underneath the teeth, we have these same type of marks. They are a little bit darker, so there isn't quite as much of a noticeable highlight, but we still need to include them. These lines are also a little bit shorter. And lastly, I am going to put dark values in the teeth. So this area is a little bit smaller. I'm going to need to sharpen my colored pencil. And with the teeth, it is important to make these look like they have a variety of values and that they're rounded. So there are some like darker spots, kind of like where this little gap is that we drew. And then there's some darker spaces near the bottom of the teeth. So we want to make sure that these look like they're kind of fitting in the socket of the skull. And the teeth on the left side, these aren't nearly as dark, so I'm not really going to use too many marks for those. And then the bottom row of teeth, these are going to be quite a bit darker just because light is blocking out the bottom teeth because of the top teeth. They're covering those. So the next thing I am going to do, because it looks like I have most of my dark values here, I'll probably put a few more on this cheekbone. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is start working with some midtones. I forgot to add this one. And so the midtone value, you can use really any other color that isn't super dark. White obviously isn't going to be too great of a choice. If you are using the complement of the color that you selected, so for example, the complement of orange is blue, what's going to happen, these are going to mix and you're going to get some brownish values because when two complements mix together, they're going to neutralize one another. So I'm going to avoid the orange for this one. I think I'm going to use magenta. So I'm going to use blue and magenta for my colors. So as I mentioned just a second ago, wherever it's the brightest, I'm just going to leave the paper. So for example, it's pretty bright right here. It's really bright on this part of the skull, or on the jaw. This area is pretty bright. A little bit brighter values on the edge or rim of the nose. It's pretty bright on this side. So I just want to keep that in mind as I'm using my magenta color. Now everywhere else where it's kind of like a middle value or it's not super dark, I'm going to put down some of this magenta color. And if the magenta overlaps the blue, that's fine. That's actually not bad at all. So I'm just going to fade out the magenta once we get to the highlights in here. And remember with your colored pencil, make sure you're kind of following those outside lines so the face is shaped correctly. So I'm going to leave most of that area white. And some middle tone values right here, otherwise the edge is pretty bright. And there's kind of a middle tone value right underneath where the jaw connects to the upper portion of the skull. Otherwise, the jawbone is pretty bright as well. I'm going to take my magenta and kind of fade it into this blue shadow right there. And then once we kind of get to this area of the jaw, it starts jumping back into the middle tones where it's not as bright as what it is going to be on this side. Right on the edge on this side of the jaw, it is, or the chin, it is pretty bright. So I'm just going to let that stay white. Even on this portion inside the nose, I'm going to use my colored pencil and add just a little bit of magenta, overlap it with the blue that I have. And maybe just put a little magenta right here in the septum area. And have some right on the bridge of the nose and then just kind of fade it down into white right here. Put maybe a little magenta in this spot. And then I'm going to use some on the brow. So I've got kind of this bright highlight along the bone that helps form the temple. I'm going to leave that white. And again, like what we did with the blue, if you need a kind of a darker middle value or mid-tone, you can just press a little bit harder. I've got a highlight right here, so I'm going to just skip that area. And then all along here, it's pretty bright and white, so I don't really want to push too much color into that space. And just a few spaces left. I'm going to put some color right under the cheekbone. But again, this area is pretty bright. I'm going to put a little bit of magenta inside this portion of the eye socket. So there are some lighter areas in the eye socket, but they're not too terribly bright. So I'm going to use my magenta to mark that middle tone area. And then even along the palette, I'm going to just put a little bit of magenta and help kind of fade that into the white. It'll help unify all of the colors that I'm using. And I think I'm going to darken one of my shadows. So I'm going to darken the edge of the eye socket right here. So that'll help define this left edge of this eye socket. Okay, so I have all of my colors down. So I have my cup of water, so just plain water. And in order to get what we would call a painterly effect, even though I have water on my brush, I'm going to try and squeegee a lot of that water out. So I'm just taking my fingers and kind of pulling the excess water off the brush. And what this will do, it'll allow me to have more like texture and brush strokes once I start painting. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to start with the dark areas. And I really am just going to follow all of the lines that I made once I put down my colored pencils. So I'm just following that same texture and direction of the lines that I was working with. So every little single brush stroke that you make should follow that direction. And so since you are pulling some of that excess water off of your brush, you may just have to get more water on your brush than you're used to. Now, when I get to the areas that I wanted really bright, I just left white with the paper. So where I didn't put any colored pencil, I'm not even going to brush into those spots. I'm just going to let those be. And then I can come back to those later. And so for this particular part in this painting, I'm using my flat brush. So it has that kind of chiseled pointed end. Because personally, I feel like I can manipulate the paint and get more brush strokes with it than some of the other brushes. So for example, what I can do with this brush is I've got plain water on the brush. And once I start kind of painting in this area, I can kind of use the brush like a chisel where I'm just pushing color to define certain areas. And what it does, it leaves kind of a darker, like defined line. So for this part of the eye, it's pretty dark. There's kind of like a ring that forms like this. And then it fades into some of those midtones. Now there is this hole in the eye socket where the optical nerves are going to connect to the brain. So I just want to make sure that I skip that portion. So I got this a little too dark. So what I'm doing, I'm just kind of pressing hard with my brush. And what it does, it builds up this color, and now I have kind of this area of excess color, and I can kind of just move that around, kind of put it back in this middle area where it needs to be a little darker. And I may go back up here and finish the rest of the forehead area. So I'm starting to enter another spot where the color is going to be a lot lighter, and then it's just really going to need to be white or close to white. And so for this particular painting, because I'm working with more texture and it's a little bit more expressive with color, um, don't be afraid to try and force yourself to work quickly. If you hold the brush in the middle, and this was the same technique I was using when I was putting down the colored pencil marks. If you hold the pencil or the brush like in the middle or a little bit higher up, you're less likely to try and create like sharper details and get caught up on small details. And so you loosen up just a little bit with your technique. So it's good for creating texture and creating more expressive lines and working with more expressive colors in your art. It's just going to fade up to where we have this highlight. So again, as you're doing this, just make sure that you're following the lines that you originally put down, because that really is important in terms of keeping the form and shape of your artwork or your three-dimensional object that you're working with. Now, once you get to small detail areas like uh, underneath the bottom row of teeth where we have those kind of sockets that we talked about, you may have to go a little bit slower so you don't lose some of those details. And then same with the palette area above. So I'm going to start where I have those dark values and just kind of fade those out into the white areas. So underneath the cheekbone is pretty dark. Come back to the teeth here in a minute. So I have this dark area of the nasal cavity where the nose is. So this is a little bit lighter right here. I still want to emphasize this kind of darker blue. So I have the other eye socket. So again, I'm going to kind of start in where that dark blue was originally put in. I had a little too much water on my brush that time. So as you can see, it kind of pulled up a little bit more than what I was wanting. So it lost some of the texture and lines I was wanting to keep. But I can always go back in later and try and put those back in there. I got the brow also. So form this. And then this fades into a highlight. And we have this kind of highlighted edge on the side. So this is kind of rough right here. So I just have plain water on my brush, and I'm just gonna kind of go over this and break up some of these rough lines and then kind of fade it into what I already have. Jump back in here where we have the cheekbone. That gets a little bit brighter right in that area. So just have a few more lines to go over with my water. And then once this dries, I can add dry colored pencil texture on top of it. And so what that dry colored pencil will do, it'll help bring out some of those textures again, if I'm wanting those. And I still have to go over and touch up the teeth, so I can't forget about that. Now, on some areas where it may be kind of bright, but it's just not white in terms of how bright it is, I can just take plain water on my brush and I can just kind of brush over this area and try and pick up a little bit of color on the edges here. And it will alter the color a little bit, but it won't make it too dark. So I can do the same kind of in this area, a little bit right here, in this back area of the skull. Go over it just a little bit, same in this spot. So what I'm doing, I'm just adding kind of a touch of color without like over coloring some of those highlights. All right, so I'm going to look at the teeth now. So I'm going to have to slow down just a little bit to get some of the values for the teeth. And the teeth are probably a good place to go over with dry colored pencil once this is entirely dry. And looks like I forgot to put some of those like kind of reddish midtones on the teeth also, because they're all just straight blue. So I want to maybe touch that up with dry colored pencil also. All right, so I'm gonna let this dry, and then what I will do next after this is dry and I've heat pressed it so it's nice and flat because my paper's gotten pretty curled, I'm just going to go on top of it with some dry colored pencil and bring back some of the textures and some of the dark values. So specifically like around the eye socket, I can really push those back. I can push the nose in a lot more with the colored pencil because I can press really hard and I can get some of those darker values. So that will be the next step that I do. So that'll be optional if you would like to do that on your drawing.